Can an aluminum frame set ride like a steel frame set? Kind of. I've been riding the Tyrant Beastie now for the past 3 weeks, and I just got back from about a 27-mile ride, mixed surfaces on my regular loop, and I have some thoughts on it. So the whole idea of the Tyrant Beastie is that it is a street-worthy aluminum bike. The most interesting thing about it is that Tyrant designed the Beastie to be intentionally heavier, intentionally more durable, and more robust. They did this through making the walls of the tubing a lot thicker than a typical aluminum fixed gear, because a lot of aluminum fixed gears try to hit that mark of being as light for the money as possible. So it's really refreshing to see that Tyrant went the completely opposite direction to make it heavier, to make it theoretically more comfortable, and to make it more durable for the people that ride fixed gears out on the streets, which is most of us, because ain't nobody got a track unless you live in like one of 20 cities in the world. Tyrant is essentially trying to make an aluminum bike ride more like a steel bike. And while I was riding it short distances on smooth pavement around the neighborhood, I have to say that the Tyrant Beastie is definitely the most comfortable aluminum bike that I've ever tried. I am primarily a steel bike rider. That is my bias. I absolutely love steel bikes for how durable they are, how reliable they are, how comfortable they are. I just love how steel bikes ride. So for me, my bias is that the Beastie is definitely facing an uphill battle. And when I took it out today for about a 27-mile ride on mixed surfaces, yes, it is the most comfortable aluminum bike that I've ever tried. And it might even be my favorite aluminum bike that I've ever tried, but it's still an aluminum bike. For many of you, it's going to be a positive thing because it has a lot of the characteristics that people like about aluminum bikes, that they are really stiff, really rocket shippy if you sprint on them, if you climb on them, if you put a lot of power through the pedals. But if you're somebody like me who prefers the comforts and the shock absorbing qualities of a steel frame set, this isn't going to be it for you. The Beastie definitely feels a lot more street worthy, a lot more substantial than pretty much any other aluminum bike I've tried. My previous favorite aluminum fixed gear was the State 6061. What do they call it? Is that really just a 6061 version 2? Because it didn't ride like a typical aluminum bike and it was more comfortable. This takes that idea and steps it up to the next level. Now, again, on smooth pavement, it is pretty convincing in absorbing the buzz of the road. But once I took it out to the countryside where the pavement is so rough you might as well be riding off-road, that's where the aluminum characteristics started to creep back in of the whole chatteriness and joltiness. Like, I ride that loop a lot. It's just one of my main loops that I ride around town. And after riding it on the Tyrant Beastie, I am really fatigued. It's just the same aluminum chatteriness, where over time it really wears down the rider. Like, for instance, I rode a Century bike ride on the Tyrant Legacy, and that bike made 100 miles feel like 70 miles. Great. I rode 27 miles on the Tyrant Beastie, and that ride felt more like a 40-mile ride. It was just a lot more tiring to try to stay steady and stay comfortable and stay relaxed on aluminum bikes for me, and the Tyrant Beastie is no exception to that. For me, aluminum bikes are pretty jolting and jarring to ride on rougher stuff. You can especially feel it when you're curb hopping up or down. For me, a steel bike that is truly comfortable feels like jumping with your knees bent, where there's some give, some flex, some absorption of the shock, but jumping off a curb or up a curb on an aluminum bike feels a lot like jumping with just straight locked knees, where the force will just jolt through. It is an aluminum bike still. It still has large diameter tubing. The tubing is thicker, but it'll still ride like an aluminum bike, albeit just a little bit more comfortably. And we can argue about the carbon fork until the cows come home. You guys already know that I'm personally not a fan of carbon forks because I don't want to gamble with my life, and bikes are something that I keep for a very, very long time and use very hard. But just from the practicality standpoint, I ride, rain or shine. I use a clip-on front fender, and like it just barely fits around these big aero fork legs, but it fits. That's a plus. I also have to give the Beastie credit for its tire clearance. It can fit 28 in the front and 32 in the rear, which is exactly what I'm running. And the tire clearance definitely helps out a lot to dampen the chatter of the aluminum frame set. And speaking of that tire clearance, it does help with off-roading because I am riding 28 in the front, 32 in the rear. It can do it fine. There were some parts of my ride that I just could not do, regardless of what fixed gear I was on, unless it was a very specific low gear ratio, huge tire, like 45 plus track lacrosse bike. And the Beastie, mostly because of the tire clearance, can handle dry, harder packed off-road just fine. The wet stuff, just like most other fixed gears with 28s or skinnier, a little bit sketchy, a little bit slippery. It's very stiff. It's very responsive to your inputs, albeit if a bit fatiguing. And the geometry still feels really good, where it's super responsive, easy to flick it around corners, and just you look where you want to go and the bike follows kind of thing. Not quite as responsive and not quite as aggressive feeling as the Tyrant Legacy, though. Go check out my review if you haven't seen that yet. I keep comparing the Tyrant Beastie to the Tyrant Legacy because even though they are very different looking bikes, there is some overlap between the two, where the Beastie is an aluminum bike that is somewhat trying to ride like a steel bike, and the Legacy is a steel bike that is somewhat trying to ride like an aluminum bike. But in my opinion so far, taking a steel bike and making it stiffer with bigger tubing, these are ride qualities that I very much prefer in a lot of different ways, compared to taking an aluminum bike and trying to make it ride more like a steel bike with thicker wall tubing. So it really depends on which side of the fence you're on when it comes to steel versus aluminum. Each will ride very differently, even though they're trying to meet in the middle. Something extremely important that quite frankly doesn't get talked about nearly enough when it comes to steel versus aluminum frame sets is comfort. Because on paper, a lot of people think the aluminum bike is faster, has better stiffness to weight ratios, you can make it in exotic shapes and make it more aerodynamic and all this gobbledygook, but that's on paper. We live in the real world. The most important factor when it comes to a bike or any vehicle is the engine. You and I are the engine of the bicycle, and we cannot perform at our best unless we are comfortable. For me, personally, it may be different for you, I cannot ride to my fullest ability and my fullest power when I am riding a super stiff aluminum bike for longer distances, say over 15 miles or so. I just get so tired. Everything gets sore. Like, a lot of people say that they can't ride fixed gear anymore because their knees hurt, and I have just never had that problem on a supple steel bike. My knees never hurt after I ride my bike, but after riding a stiff aluminum bike for 27 miles or so, my knees, they hurt a little bit. I hate being harsh, but it does kind of feel like I am pushing a bigger gear ratio, not just on the Tyrant Beastie, but on any other aluminum bike compared to when I am riding a steel bike. This 49-17 gear ratio on the Tyrant Beastie, as well as other aluminum bikes for me, it just feels about one tooth bigger on the cog. It feels more like a 49-16. And that perception just comes from the discomfort and the fatigue that I'm experiencing in my calves, in my knees, in my thighs, in my back, in my arms, because they're just too chattery for me, especially where I like to ride out on the backcountry roads where it might as well be cobblestone. And yeah, the Beastie will excel on smooth pavement, but to me, that feels a bit limiting, where the frame set is dictating where I can and can't go. The most fun part of cycling to me is that you can push yourself to your limits, and even push yourself beyond your limits. But when I'm riding an aluminum bike, it feels like I am being artificially limited by my bike. The question that you need to ask yourself is, do you like aluminum or do you like steel? Do you want your steel bike to ride more stiff, or do you want an aluminum bike to be more comfortable? Because depending on the approach, they ride very differently and will still try to suit different riders better. I'm a steel guy. I primarily ride long distances. I'm not like a huge sprinter or anything like that. So when it comes between the two, I would definitely go for the Tyrant Legacy, but they have very different ride qualities and suit very different riding styles. If you primarily do shorter distances and like to do sprintier, burstier kind of riding and still ride pretty aggressively but want a touch more comfort, the Beastie's a great option. But I'm not super convinced on the concept of it. I will keep riding it and report back to you and see if my mind changes. Hopefully it does. But something my mind won't change on is this message from our sponsor, Wabi Cycles. No joke, Wabi Cycles has changed my life, and I'm not just talking about the fact that they give me money to say the things that I would say anyway about them, but rather their bikes are actually so good that it's another thing to look forward to when I get on my bike every day. They help reduce the friction that we have and the excuses that we tell ourselves that we shouldn't ride our bikes or that we don't want to ride our bikes, because they are just so dang fun to ride. And part of what makes it so life-changing for me and makes it so fun to ride is that these bikes are meticulously hand-built out of top-tier Reynolds 725 or Columbus Spirit steel. It has a ride quality that just encourages you to want to get on the bike and encourages you to keep pedaling the bike once you are on it. My Wabi is one of my most treasured possessions because it tangibly improves my life. And if you're looking to get one for yourself, be sure to check out Wabi Cycles, linked in the description. And Fixie famous shoutouts to David K, Julian Corona, Brandon Black, Brent David, Mohr, Perez, Onchi, and Brakeless.Illini for helping to make these Fix Gear videos possible through their support on Patreon. And remember that life is short, but don't make it shorter, so be sure to ride your bike every day to be reasonably dangerous.